Welcome to珍珠奶茶podcast, a journal of sharing about learning Chinese between languages, law, and Taiwan. You can choose the audio track in French or in English depending on your preference. Enjoy listening! In this first episode, we are going to do a little summary about my level in Chinese and the way I learned Chinese before my exchange. Why Chinese? That's a question I often get when I say I'm learning Mandarin. And it's a fair one. Why this language in particular? I started learning Chinese in 8th grade because I had the opportunity to choose a third language as an elective. I was already learning English and German, but I was fascinated by this language that was so different from European ones and by Chinese cultures. Because yes, Mandarin has nothing in common with French. Sentence structure, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, everything is different. It was also a personal challenge to learn the language known as the hardest in the world. So I continued studying Chinese in high school, still as an elective. In the end, quite unexpectedly, I chose it as my second language in my double bachelor in law and languages instead of German. Why? Because I saw more potential for growth with Chinese, especially in the professional world. Today, it's a key language in international business. And then I traveled to Taiwan for the first time, and that trip made me even more motivated to learn the language. So, is Chinese really a difficult language to learn? First, a quick clarification. There are two types of Chinese writing systems. Simplified characters, 简体字, are mainly used in China and in most Chinese language teaching abroad. And traditional characters, 繁体字, are mainly used in Taiwan and Hong Kong and were previously also used in international Chinese teaching. As for the spoken language, it's generally the same, although some words and expressions vary depending on the region. For example, in Beijing, people often add the particle "er" at the end of certain sentences or questions to ask where. One might say 在哪儿, while in Shanghai and in other places using Chinese, it's more common to say 在哪里. Another example, to say week, the word 星期 is often used, but in Taiwan, people prefer to use 礼拜. Some words even change meaning depending on where you are. 小姐, for instance, is a polite way to say miss or waitress, but it can also be used to designating a woman of easy virtue. So be careful when you use this word. And that's not even mentioning Cantonese, which is a completely different language from Mandarin. So, is Chinese a hard language or not? Well, yes and no. Let's start with the positive aspects. Grammatically speaking, Chinese is not that complicated. There are very few rules. No conjugation, no complex verb tenses, no gender or number agreement. And unlike Japanese or Korean, there isn't really a formal hierarchy built into the language. You just say sir or madame, and while there is the polite particle nin used for formal speech, honestly, it's rarely used in everyday life, like in shops or at the market. You'll mostly hear it in more formal contexts, like the workplace. But despite this grammatical simplicity, in my opinion, there are three main challenges that give Chinese its reputation as the hardest language in the world. First, Chinese doesn't have an alphabet. It's a logosyllabic language, making it the only modern language without an alphabetic writing system. Each word is represented by one or more characters, 汉字, and these characters express ideas, not just sounds like letters do. That means you can't guess a word like you might in French or in English. You either know it or you don't. There are said to be over 100,000 Chinese characters, and new ones are still being created to describe new ideas. Luckily, it's estimated that knowing between 4,000 and 6,000 characters is enough to read a newspaper, and the official list of standardized characters includes 8,105. Still, that's a lot to memorize. The second challenge, and probably the most well-known, is writing. Even though simplified characters have made things a bit easier, each character has a precise stroke order. If you make a mistake, it can completely change the meaning of the word. For example, 木 means wood. 本, which had just an extra horizontal stroke, means root. Forgetting or adding a single stroke isn't a small mistake, it changed everything. Finally, the third difficulty, tones. There are 4 tones in Mandarin, and they are essential to a word's meaning. The best example is the syllable ma. Ma for the first tone, ma for the second tone, ma for the third tone, ma for the fourth tone. Yes, I repeat it a lot before I get it right, especially for the second tone because it's the hardest for me. Ma, 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 ma. Depending on the tone you use, the meaning changes completely, and if you forget the tone, your sentence might mean something else or nothing at all. Personally, this is the hardest part for me. Sometimes I'm afraid of saying something wrong or not being understood, and that really holds me back from speaking. To make things even trickier, some characters change tone depending on where they are in the sentence. So even if you know the correct tone, you can still get it wrong when speaking. It's really destabilizing. And then there is the challenge of linking all the tones together naturally in a sentence. It becomes a real diction exercise, kind of like our version of tongue twisters such as Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. And yes, of course, I practice it a lot before saying it right. And recently, I even learned that if you emphasize some words in the sentence, it can change the meaning of the sentence, a difficulty that we can live without. So, how do you actually learn Chinese? In my case, I've tried two main approaches, school classes and private lessons. School classes. Throughout middle and high school, I was able to learn the basics of Chinese, everyday vocabulary, writing rules and stroke order, and the first notions of syntax. Then at university, in my applied languages bachelor, the level really stepped up. I learned a lot more grammar and vocabulary, but more importantly, I discovered the cultural side of the language, history, traditions, geopolitics, and so on. The transition from high school to university was a real leap. My first year especially was a big jump, and you really need to stay committed to keep up. Pros of this method: regular exposure to Mandarin, about 6 hours of class per week for 3 years, building a solid base vocabulary, and developing certain grammar and sentence structure habits. The limitations of this: the focus is often on technical vocabulary, emphasizing quantity over quality. There's a gap between the Chinese taught at university and the Chinese spoken by native speakers. For example, the basic greeting we learn at first, 你好,你好吗, hello, how are you, is rarely used in real life. People are more likely to say 最近怎么样 or 你吃好吗? Another example for sorry or excuse me, native speakers will usually say 不好意思 rather than 对不起. Second, private lessons. I started taking private lessons in my second year of university because even though the curriculum was progressing, I still felt I had a lot of gaps in my foundations. More importantly, I needed more practice in listening comprehension and active communication in Chinese. These lessons helped me a lot in learning vocabulary through listening, using audio materials, so reverse the traditional method, listening first and then study, that we use in university. And above all, have real conversations with a native speaker. This last point made a huge difference in my progress. I was able to improve my listening skills, fine-tune my pronunciation, and gain more confidence in speaking. Because let's be honest, speaking a foreign language is intimidating, and often it's the fear of making mistakes that hold us back the most. And beside this method, I used to listening to Chinese through music, podcasts, and series, which is really good tools to improve your listening skills. So then, why go on an exchange? Because, in my opinion, I had reached the limit of what school learning could offer. I felt like I was hitting a glass ceiling. Despite all the classes, I wasn't improving as much as before, and the same challenges I'd had from the beginning were still here. And most importantly, there was no opportunity to keep studying Mandarin in my master's program, or at least not as in depth as in my applied languages bachelor. So even fewer chances to really and effectively progress. Now that I'm doing an exchange in Taiwan, I have one clear goal: boost my level of Chinese. To do that, I want to learn the basics of traditional characters, improve my speaking skills, be able to understand everyday conversations, and most of all, be able to express myself. Order food, ask questions, ask for information, talk with my friends. In short, I want to really speak in everyday life. If I had to sum up all of this in one word, it will be dare. Dare to learn a new language, even if it's very different from your own. Dare to speak, to practice, to make mistakes and try again. Dare to connect with native speakers, because in my opinion, that's the best way to improve. I know how intimidating it can be. I've been through it and I still go through it every day. But through this podcast, I want to encourage you to take that step too. And who knows, maybe it will even inspire you to start learning Chinese yourself. Thank you for listening to珍珠奶茶podcast, your monthly bubble of Taiwan and Mandarin, and we will soon meet again for the next episode.